We're joined here once again on Go Down TV by Andy Fuller. Andy, thanks very much for joining us again.
Pleasure. It's great to speak to you again, Alan.
So let's talk about one thing in particular, and the recent announcement of plans for the development and growth of American football in the UK. First of all, can we just have a chat about what inspired this development in the first place?
Sure. The history of BAFA's strategy sort of goes back to 2005, 2006, when a document entitled Getting to American Football was authored by principally a gentleman called Ken Walters. That served as the BAFA strategy from about 2007 onwards, and it was a very successful strategy in many ways. It helped us leverage funding from a variety of different agencies, and it also provided a coherent platform for the development of the sport as it stood at that point in time. That was due for a period of renew in sort of 2010, 2011, where we look at the successes and weaknesses of the implementation of that strategy. And at that time, we recognised that there was considerable strengths to what had been written, but also some issues that needed addressing in a new strategy. Principally, that the previous strategy was almost like what's the word I'm looking for? If you remember back to sort of almost sort of one of these sort of kit programs where you have a series of elements of kit, and I think people understood that there were significant amounts of things going on in football, huge sort of numbers of sort of little component parts, but it possibly didn't communicate how you put those component parts together to make an end product particularly effectively for our membership. At the same time of sort of reviewing and looking at how the strategy sort of evolved and communicated and how it was implemented, we also went through some considerable changes with the governing body, which led us into a period of review of our governance. So we set up a governance review project, which there were some tremendously valuable contributions from our membership towards. We closed that and looked at the feedback that we'd received from a variety of different sections of the community, some stuff that we'd brought in from learnings from other governing bodies, other sporting organisations, and effectively what we spent maybe a year, something along those lines, knitting all that information together so that we could provide a communicable strategy that looked at how we develop the sport alongside or allied to a renewed governance structure, which would see the evolution of the British American Football Association, so that as we look to implement a strategy for the forthcoming years from 2013 onwards, we would have a governance infrastructure that was fit for purpose for delivering that. And I think it's one of those things. People are under no illusions that these things are always something that evolves. There's never this sort of utopian infrastructure and utopian state where a sport says, yep, everything's perfect in terms of our grassroots strategy, in terms of our national teams, in terms of how we operate. As a sport progresses from one stage to another stage, then you almost have to reflect, see what's going well, and then plan for the future. But I think what we've come up with certainly serves as something which will lead us to a more prosperous future over the next few years, and then people will review the implementation of this strategy, and will reconfigure certain elements, look after the vestiges of it that are really strong, and at some point in the future, 2017, 2020, they'll redefine how we progress. So it's based on where we've been, the learnings from where we've been, how we can improve on where we've been, and lay down a stronger future for the next sort of 2 to 5 years, the medium term.
Okay, so you describe a little bit about the build up to this point, and we end up with this the document released describing it from Schoolyard to the Super Bowl, as you say, looking at different categories of growth of the sport. And if we quickly look through it, you divide it broadly into three categories of growing the sport, sustaining it, and then also an excelling or excellence aspect of it. So can you, as we look through these details of it, can you describe how they'll all merge together to ensure that there will be a proper and smooth development for people involved from the very first day that they take up the sport right through to the opportunities where potentially they could be going to a high level of playing or coaching?
Sure. I think where we have to focus in the first instance is on a coherent player pathway. I think what's happened in a number of sports in the past, and ours is not immune from this in any way, shape or form, is that a lot of activities have taken place sort of independently, and there's been that sort of element of development where we've looked at development in sort of one particular sector of the sport or another particular sector of the sport. And perhaps at times it's lacked a degree of coherency. And I think as we sort of take a step back, you look at the ways in which you can provide greater coherency for the development of the sport. And as per the document that you've seen from Schoolyard to Super Bowl, the principal platform for that coherency has got to be a player development pathway, and that is providing or understanding the needs of an athlete when they enter the sport at a particular age. It could be 18, it could be 12, and then how they will develop within the sport over a period of time, dependent on their particular entry level. What that does is that enables us then to build and reinforce the infrastructure around that, so that we make sure that those people who come into the sport are receiving the best levels of coaching, support, however you might define support, that they can, dependent on their needs at a particular time. So, if we're looking at growing the sport, there are certain ways in which we can focus on, known growth areas, the university sector, for example, the emerging collegiate sector, where we know that people have a particular interest in setting up teams, and because of their age and because of the infrastructures that support them, they have the capacity to do so. But I think, over time, there's going to be that sort of shifting of the focus towards the youth level, and we look at ways in which we can reinforce some of the existing good practice that exists and benchmark that for other people to aspire to and replicate. But we've got to be in that situation where we say, okay, if a young person is coming into the sport at the age of 10, 12, do we know what they need? And can we deliver what they need? A young lad at the age of 10 or a young girl at the age of 12 or whatever, what sorts of things should they know? And I'm not just talking necessarily about the specific techniques of football, how to throw a football if you want to be a quarterback, or how to do X, Y, and Z sort of specific techniques. But we're talking about some of the wider development issues around young people engaged in sport. Their understanding of how football sits within the sort of the capacity to deliver physical literacy. How can we utilise our sport to reinforce good practice for agility, balance, coordination, kinesthesia, all these sorts of things that are, not just going to aid them in their ability to take part in our sport, but also support them as they make choices as to whether they want to go and play soccer or cricket or do track and field or anything along those lines. So, we look at how we can grow the game, across all age ranges and all abilities, but particularly within the youth element. So we can look at them from a technical perspective. We can also look at, how we as a governing body and how clubs and how a range of different stakeholders can support those people so that, it's a better environment for them to come into. So we can understand the sort of, not only the physical demands that we're placing on them, but also the social demands. And that will then link into how we can sustain participation, how we can provide those sort of fertile grounds for people to become really active members of a club, how we retain them effectively. And if we're looking at this in the holistic sense, there's not going to be a huge number of people necessarily who then progress to the sort of the excellence side of things. But, we've got to make sure that we have that infrastructure that provides people with a great induction to the sport and a fabulous experience that means that they want to stay, to sort of focus on the sustain. But where those people do exhibit talent, that we have the right infrastructure to be able to identify that talent and to be able to nurture it so that we can progress them into the structures that A exist now and B will exist in the future, so that they can and this sounds a really bad word, but we can exploit that talent, and I mean that in the nicest sense of the word, so that they can fulfil their potential, and that we can benefit from it. Better national team performance, players potentially going and playing in the college system in the US, and ideally long term going and playing in the NFL and generating that sort of profile that means more people want to take up the sport, that it's even more aspirational. But so that's sort of the looking at the grow, sustain, excel agenda. But we mustn't just focus on the players here. This has got to be part of a wider cultural development that says, there are some fabulous people within our sport in a coaching capacity. How do we work with them to identify the talents that they have and unlock the potential that they have, so that they can be part of our national teams of the future, so that they can lead their clubs to success in the future. Moreover, in a voluntary capacity, how do we identify those people who have tremendous talent, whether it be for working within our governing body or at a club level or wherever? So what are their skills? How do we utilize those skills effectively? Because like many other governing bodies, we're in that situation where often you identify somebody who's particularly good at something. Maybe they start off at club level, and you go, okay, they've achieved a considerable amount in their club. We then want them to be part of, another part of our infrastructure. Maybe it's working with our national teams. Maybe it's working with the governing body. Maybe it's doing, a variety of different things. And actually, you end up giving them so much work that they don't do any of their jobs as effectively as they can. So, it's about systems and structures that we put in place. But B, it's also about the culture that we put in place that means that people feel enfranchised and can develop and fulfil their potential.
So what you hear there is talking about developing good practices within clubs and organisations to try and retain players, also looking after the players so hopefully they can continue to grow on their own. But we've seen a few good examples of it around the country for adult and youth development systems, and there are aspects of this plan that include youth development, as you just discussed there, as well as adult development, trying to get new adults into the club. But a lot of clubs will be probably listening to this and thinking it's all well and good, but what kind of guidance will we as a club be able to have, and what kind of support will we receive in order to go there, and what on the other side should we be doing ourselves to make sure that we hold up our end of this?
You're correct. I think what can often happen is you have a disconnect between an idealistic strategy and its implementation on the ground. And when I say implementation on the ground, I don't necessarily mean in clubs. I can mean at organisational level as well within the governing body. I think what you have to do to a certain extent is underpin everything with an education programme. We're very fortunate in that we've through some of the stuff that came through the governance review, through some of the stuff that people have provided, through some of the information that people have provided us with, equally some of the identification we've been able to carry out. You can see the pockets of best practice that exist where clubs are doing an awful lot of really positive things within their local community, and it's enabling them to sustain their development and grow and thrive. And I think we have to look at how they've got to that position, and we've started to look at how we've got to that position, so we can tease out some really practical examples of good practice that we can then inform people about. But I think the thing that underpins all of this is about education, and this is where there's a sort of a two-sided focus on responsibilities. As a governing body, we're tremendously fortunate in that we're exposed to a huge number of examples of good practice that exists both within our sport and within other sports. Moreover, we're able to see an awful lot of information that relates to really good sports development practice. We've got to communicate that effectively. We've got to be able to understand what our members want and how to provide that information to them, to empower them. Not only to empower them to say, here's how Club X within our sport or cricket or whoever it may be has gone on and developed their program, learn from this, build from it, but also so that we can engage in meaningful discussion. I think, at times development within our sport and indeed within other sports has happened where the objectives perhaps have been set without meaningful discussions taking place around some of the key issues that we need to address. And by that, if I refer back to your previous point about merging grow, sustain and excel around a player development pathway, if we sit and think about it, there's probably not been a meaningfully communicated player development pathway that underpins the development of our sport in the past. There's no common currency for discussion on a number of the issues that exist around long-term athlete development perspective, for example, or physical development or the social side of things. There's probably been an element of a vacuum, and the more we can sort of put a skeletal framework in place, and we're looking at the USA football model at this point in time. The more we can empower people against delivery of a meaningful structure. And when I say empower them, not just in terms of providing them with enhanced knowledge so that it makes them better practitioners when they come to coaching or whatever it may be, or indeed liaising with their local stakeholders who might want to understand, the rationale of what they want to do in schools, how football will provide support for physical literacy and so forth. But moreover, we're empowering them to challenge the football authorities, both us now and in the future, and saying, okay, we're having a debate about the future direction of this sport, and we're all talking with with a degree of confidence that we understand where we're going. I think at times that there's probably been an absence of that, and we need to make sure that it doesn't persist in the future. I think so. There's from our perspective a need to empower, to educate and inform, and equally, it's that sort of flip side of things where people within clubs or organisations go and learn and expose themselves to a range of different things. You look at some of the successful programs that exist around the country, and it would be remiss of me to specifically name, programs at this point in time, I think. But, we can all look around the country and say, okay, this team or this club has done exceptionally well. And underpinning that, you tend to find a group of people who have, they're passionate about their football, they're passionate about their sport, but they've also been incredibly proactive about, enhancing their own learning, going and working with their county sport partnership, to identify development courses that are going on in their area, whether that be to do with coaching courses, whether that be to do with club development courses from an organisational perspective. And I think, so there's the responsibility that falls on two parts. We've got to educate people as to the things that we need to focus upon and how we can engage in discussion on that, and then be met halfway by people who are keen to further their own learning and foster a really good culture of club development and personal development within that. So, I would say that's sort of the key first step is about opening up those horizons to education and learning. And that sounds really glib, and I can imagine people sort of sat there going, Andy, yes, A, I have tried to find these things out. B, I've only got a limited amount of money to do this sort of thing. C, I've only got a limited amount of time to do this thing. And I can completely understand that. And I think, as we progress over the coming months and indeed over the coming years as we implement this, we'll have a better understanding of who needs to do what, when and where, and at what price. And when I say price, I mean financially, but also, in terms of time and other things that people have to give up on these, when they attend courses, family type stuff. And to give you a context with the University League, we announced at our pre-season meeting back in the early autumn 2012 that we'd be undertaking a piece of work at the end of this season where we review everything about our university teams. We look at the facilities they've got. We look at the training times they're allocated. We look at the amount of uniform they have, their asset list, etc. But crucially, we also look at how many coaches they've got, how often those coaches contribute to coaching sessions. How long do they contribute for? At what cost do they contribute? So we can really begin to build up an insight into the operations of our community, the hidden economy of it, for want of a better word, so that we can service it better. I think there's some brilliant work that's been going on, I should say, within our clubs, that we've not really supported particularly well. Equally, there are some things that BAFA has done well to try and support clubs. The Kickstart initiatives, being one example of that. And the more we can marry those sorts of things together around a shared purpose and a common currency for discussion, I think the better off we'll be.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of teams are actually looking forward to being able to get hold of this kind of advice and tips to allow them to grow themselves, and then also looking to grow support networks across the country so that they can not only grow themselves, but also their respective leagues and the sport in general can grow. But part of that comes down to advertising and marketing. And there is this marketing and commercial aspect as part of the description of this, of generating more awareness of teams and the sport within the country, as it is still a fairly minor sport. But obviously ourselves at Gridiron TV are aware of the need to try and grow popularity and awareness. But how important a role do you see that in this whole process in ensuring that the sport is taken seriously by outside stakeholders and potentially funders and, of course, new players, coaches and new people growing into the sport?
Sure. It's critical. And I think we have to be very, very clear as to how those sorts of things are segmented, where things overlap and where there are differences. We've worked closely with a variety of stakeholders in recent years to provide greater knowledge and understanding of our sport, of the people involved within our sport, the culture that exists, and crucially the opportunities that will exist. And when I say stakeholders, I mean county sport partnerships, sports councils, wider agencies who are involved in different capacities in the development of sport. Our people will know that we've been working with our all-party parliamentary group We're incredibly grateful for the amount of effort that Richard Fuller and his colleagues on that have put into providing advice and guidance to us, to supporting a lot of the work that we've been doing behind the scenes to get to the stage where we can release this strategy. And we're equally grateful to a range of different stakeholders like Sport England, like the Sport and Recreation Alliance, and National Council for School Sport, and so forth, who have given us considerable amounts of time and their energies to support our development agenda. So I think you can look at the sort of the marketing and commercial side of things within a context of developing those relationships and engendering a positive perspective that people can have of us. So a considerable amount of time and energy from the BAFA board and other key people has gone into that, so that we have those platforms for engagement with the people who can really influence where we want to go and provide advice and guidance. I think from there, you can then tease out the sort of the information about how we package our sport so we can leverage commercial funding against it, and how we can position it to maximise those opportunities. I guess, like many sports that don't necessarily have a TV presence. We do in the context that the NFL is obviously on television, but that's not a property owned by the governing body. Indeed, the same with the NCAA. Understanding what our properties are and how you can leverage value against those properties is something that we've started exploring, and we still need to understand further. At this point in time, the history of our sport, I suppose, is pretty much focused around bringing together a series of organisations who delivered competitions, for want of a better word, or serviced those teams in those competitions. So you had, the sort of the university side of things. You had the community football leagues side of things. You had the youth football league side of things. You had the Referees Association, who would facilitate those games going ahead, and then you had the Coaches Association, who, would provide the education platform for those sort of activities at club level to take place. And I think, you can't change your history. We've evolved that way with multiple leagues, multiple organisations, and we're gradually sort of merging all those things together. And I think what that does is it provides us a really good juncture at this point in time to say, okay, we understand that our competitions are of value. What that value is, we're still to ascertain. In terms of realising a financial contribution against that. But moreover, there are things within our sport that do have a potential financial value, but have never really sort of sat within any particular area in the past. So the development of school sports resources, for example, how we produce resources to support young people engaging within our sport. Maybe I'm getting a bit long in the tooth, but I'm sure a number of your viewers and listeners will remember things like the Coca-Cola Soccer Stars that kids in the 1980s used to do. Moreover, people, some of the younger people involved in the sport now will have done the sort of the sports hall athletic stuff that UK athletics have rolled out. All these sorts of things are independent of competitions, but they have a value in terms of the development of the sport and the development of the athlete, but they have a commercial value too. And I think what we've been able to do through going through the process of sort of putting this strategy together is saying, okay, we can bundle all these assets up together, and we could be British American Football Association sponsored by X brand, or we could, have a tier of partners who support the delivery of what we're achieving in particular areas, and they may do that against a cash value. They may do that through support in kind, but we have the sort of the framework to understand what the value of each of those is and how we can maximise it. So marketing and commercial and communications and relationship building, we see that working on two levels. It's reinforcing the positive relationships that we have with a range of different stakeholders who might not necessarily invest against a particular property of the governing body, but will aid and guide us in support and development. Equally, it is those wider sort of commercial organisations, private sector companies or whatever else they may be that could see a value in being associated with our brand as a whole or particular elements of it.
So what you're saying is you're trying to identify the aspects of the sport that are most appealing to people that can support the sport in general, and showing it off in its best light, really, to make sure that people understand the amount of passion and effort that goes into the sport in general.
Yeah, I think there's, and building the support infrastructures to ensure that we deliver against their agenda too. There's an awful lot of value, I think, in American football, but it's value that has to be realised by A, potential investment from a third party, but B, people supporting the realisation of the objectives of that investment, whether that's in paid roles or in volunteer roles. We have to be able to deliver. I think, sort of bringing it back to your point about providing that platform. Do we fully understand it? No, we don't. And that's not necessarily because we don't understand the commercial landscape, or we've not been able to draw upon the information that people can provide us from external organisations about the commercial landscape. But to a certain extent, there is an element of suck it and see on some of these things. Where we are now in terms of realising our value will change considerably, I would hope, within the next 2 years. And going back to the point at the beginning of the interview about there's not this sort of utopian structure that is the objective that once you get to, that's it, you never have to change anything, it will evolve. It's the same with these sorts of things. And as we build, we can realise other opportunities, and to sort of contextualise that within the student sector, we have a university league which impacts across 70 odd institutions, and that's fabulous within the student directorate. But we're also in the process of finalising the plans for the soft launch of our collegiate competitions. So student football, if you took it now in terms of its value, it's probably going to be slightly different now than it's going to be in 2 years' time, because there will be a whole new sector of the sort of the further education environment that we'll be able to look at. Do you separate those two and have them as separate properties, or do you combine them and they become one sort of holistic student property that somebody can buy into? So as things evolve and develop, and as we liberate investment to support the growth and development of different aspects of our sport, as they become more mature, you then have to reassess their value, whether that's collectively or independently.
Okay, well, yeah, hopefully it's something that will go and progress, and certainly a lot of teams that we hear from are looking for unique ways and different ways to engage with people. We'll come back to the document here, and another aspect you've kind of touched on a few times is talking about the whole governance and structure of it. And from looking at it, there is a changed or revamped governance and structure. So starting off just quickly, what are the kind of main benefits that you or BAFA think will come from this, and the reasons why it's changing?
I think the principal rationale for change is moving towards a more skills-based governing body at a variety of different levels. If I focus on myself, because I think if to give those sort of practical examples as illustrations, it's easier to do that. I sit as a director of the governing body, and I oversee the student directorate. And different people will have opinions on my strengths and my weaknesses, and they will interpret the development of the university competition and the emerging college and schools programs in different ways, and that's fine. But what happens is I sort of sit at the very senior level, but I'm also the person who delivers, and spends 4 or 5 hours a day answering emails, talking on the phone, researching, developing things, and all those sorts of sides of things, and that's got to change, I think, in the future. As I said at our pre-season meeting last year, by 2014, my term of office, or whatever you want to call it, will be concluded, and you have to think very carefully as to who's going to represent and who's going to deliver in the future, because to a certain extent, there's a degree of conflict in interest in being the governance and the deliverer, we have to separate those jobs out, not just to make sure that we are more effective in terms of the delivery. Because of my background prior to being involved in BAFA, and that stands me and BAFA in some respects in good stead. But I think we're at that point now with the maturity of student football that actually at board level you need somebody who isn't going to be bogged down with having to deal with 150 emails a day or whatever it might be that you receive, the phone calls and so forth, but somebody who is really well renowned within that sort of sector, who can influence, who can understand the internal dynamics of student sport, of school sport, of collegiate sport in general, and really point the governing body in the right direction to exploit the opportunities that exist. I think I've been able to do that to a point, but I think going forward, we are in a situation where we identified that a certain amount of knowledge, skill and understanding will be required, by that sort of director. I probably won't meet those future requirements. So we've got to look at the sort of person who can meet those future requirements, and also how we can bring in the people who sort of do my other side of the role, that is the delivery, working with the teams on a day-to-day basis, working with the universities on a day-to-day basis to ensure the competition develops and evolves. And I think, if you look at that as one example, the challenges of our governing body going forward are such that we have so many tremendous opportunities. The NFL and their presence in this country, the appetite and the passion of the people involved in our sport mean that there's a really positive future for American football, and you need people in place, and it could be some of the same people, it could be different people, but who have got the skills and abilities to lead that forward. But what's crucial is, rather than just saying yes, you can be elected to this role, or we think that you're a good person, because historically in a variety of voluntary organisations you have that sort of situation where people put personalities against things, or people look at it as so and so served an awful lot of time, therefore they should be elected or promoted into this senior position. We're actually saying this is what this person needs to do, this is what they're going to be accountable against. And therefore, this is the sort of person we should have in place. And I think, I think once we've established fully what that is and the change management process, we will have a governance structure that will drive the sport forward with really, really skilled people. Like I said, some of whom may exist within our sport already, some of whom may come in from different backgrounds. But I think allied to that, you have to make sure that you retain people who have tremendous knowledge and skills. There have been mistakes made in the past in football over sort of its 20-25 year history. And it's important that we understand where mistakes have been made, so that we don't what's the word I'm looking for? Make those mistakes again. Moreover, where there have been some tremendous strengths and where people understand the dynamics of football development and how it's progressed, we need to keep some of those people involved in different capacities, so that there is that transfer of knowledge. It's one of those things. If you study sort of the Olympic movement and so forth, one of the things that was really important, I think it sort of came in around sort of Sydney 2000 time, was the creation of the transfer of knowledge infrastructures, so that local organising committees weren't just reinventing the wheel on the way they did things. There was actually sort of accumulation of knowledge that was passed from organisation to organisation, so that people could learn from the failures of the past, but also build from the strengths. And I think, where we're going as a governing body is A, making sure that we have effective representation from our membership, but B, that we can bring in people who can really drive our organisation forward too, against a particular remit. And I think that's a tremendously exciting opportunity, and hopefully one we can capitalise upon, and that will serve to really drive things forward. And you'll know from the work you do with Gridiron TV and having met with people all around the country, people have invested an awful lot of time and energy and emotion into our sport, and it's right that we as the board of the governing body recognise that, capitalise upon that where we can, but crucially lay down the infrastructure so that where possible we can meet those aspirations through really effective management.
So essentially what we're looking at here is possibly changes of roles or expanding roles, so being able to cover all these aspects you mentioned. And you mentioned there potentially looking at changes in people in the role. Is that something that would be happening in the near-term future, and is this something that the people listening here, the general football community in the UK, would have a much of a say in?
I think yes, changes will occur. The time scale of those changes is sort of being looked at internally. I think what elements of this there is to recognise is A, it's having the roles identified for people to come into, whether they be incumbents against a new structure for which they're held accountable against, or whether it be new people to come into a new structure. That has to be fully identified, and I think there is that sort of shared understanding of how that skills framework should fit together at this point in time. The secondary element that comes with that is not just identifying the structure and the systems that will exist to support that, but it's also about having the capacity to be able to manage that change and implement that change effectively. Where we stand, for example, with again, I'll bring it back to my role. I could sit and make a SWOT analysis of the student footballers where it is now. I could also provide a list of the jobs I do on a day-to-day basis that people have to take care of, and the things that I think that my replacement in due course should be able to fulfill, where they'll need the knowledge and skills and understanding and so forth. From there, you then have to make sure that all your existing stakeholders, so in our case Bucks, British Collegiate Sport and so forth, they're fully engaged within the process, so that they not necessarily influence it in any way, shape or form from an outcome. This person can only be elected if we say so type thing, but make sure that they are fully aware of how we're defining and refining things, so they can play a part in that, and that they can share their understanding of how things have evolved in other sports. So, I think we're in that position where, with those sorts of organisations, we're in a relatively early stage of our relationship, and therefore it's appropriate to have those discussions at the conclusion of our current seasons to inform things for the 2013-2014 academic year, which will then mean that we can capacity build to the point where my role can be opened up for appointment or election, or however it may be. And we would also work with those organisations on trying to work out, the best frameworks for those sort of elections. Sure. So I think to sort of, again, bring it back to your original point, I think there will be changes relatively quickly, but I think they won't necessarily be sweeping changes all in one go. Again, I sort of pin the hat on the transfer of knowledge framework for that, and making sure that our infrastructure is robust enough to deal with the changes that exist. If you look at the advice and guidance on good practice for board management, you're in that situation where, you would never leave an organisation in a situation where the entire board is up for election or appointment within a particular year. You have to stage these things so that there is a degree of continuity. So you might have, under the new structure, for example, let's say there's X number of directors, a percentage of those directors would be appointed or elected in, say, 2014. A percentage of them would be appointed or elected in 2015, so that you've got a cycle whereby you've not got complete change every 4 years, and then everybody sort of sat around going, "There's nobody to grandfather me in here." We're sort of left holding the baby without a manual type sort of thing. So, there will be change, but it will be structured change, and it will be rationalised change in terms of what role people can play in that. In some of the contexts, it will be by election. In other cases, it will be people can put themselves forward for roles, whether that be for elected roles or whether that be for appointed roles. And I think we're all aware that there are some individuals within our membership who are really capable individuals, and once we sort of announce that position X or position Y is being made available for appointment or election, they'll be in that situation where they can say, okay, here's the criteria that I've got to fulfill, here's how I meet that criteria, and here's how I'm going to deliver for the rest of the football community. And I think we'll all benefit tremendously from that.
Well, it certainly seems like there's going to be a lot of change over the coming months and years, so it's certainly going to change the landscape of football. But we'll wrap it up there. So thanks very much for joining us, Andy, and explaining a few things for us, and no doubt we'll hear more on this in the coming months. And
the key thing, Alan, seeing as I've kept you here now for nearly an hour, and I'm sure people are using this as a cure for insomnia, listening to me, which is what most of my family do. I think we're in that situation where my number is on the website. The BAFA website, my phone number. My email address is on the BAFA website. If people have got comments about our governance documentation that they want to share, positive, negative, whatever it may be, please use it. Please use those numbers. There are, a lot of this was shaped by people's comments to us, and it will continue to be shaped by people's comments to us. And as a consequence, that sort of engagement is important. If people, I can't say that I'll go to every club over the course of the summer because my poor old car's on its last legs. But it is one of those things. If people, want to come and talk to them or their club, or there's opportunities to discuss things, then, more than happy to see how we can do that sort of thing. This is about continued engagement and evolution. and more than happy to take calls and questions on it.
Okay, well, I'm sure people will. So once again, thanks very much for joining us here on Gridiron TV, Andy.
No worries. Thank you very much, Alan. Take care.